This video will show you how to replace the inner tie rod end on a Toyota Matrix. This is part of the front steering and suspension located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Now once we've completed that, we're going to remove all 5 of our 21mm lug nuts and the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off, we have a clear view of our tie rod ends leading in towards our power steering rack and bellows boot. We're going to start at our jam nut here. Now for this, you can use a 19mm wrench. You're going to be turning this clockwise, bringing the nut up the inner tie rod end. We just need to break it free from the outer tie rod end. You can also use some long pliers for leverage if that's helpful. There we are, we've got plenty of movement from that now. Let's continue on to our outer tie rod end mounting nut. For this, you're going to find that you have a locking cotter pin up along the top. Go ahead and remove it and dispose of it properly. Now our cotter pin is extremely rotted, so I'm just going to continue on to removing as much of it as possible, and I'll remove the mounting nut afterward. Now that we have the cotter pin out of the way, we'll be using a 17mm for our mounting nut. We have a lot of rust on ours, so I'm going to tap this into place. After a quick inspection of the mounting nut, go ahead and start it back on a couple threads. We'll use some penetrant in this area. And now we're going to use a hammer and lightly tap on the steering knuckle. Now at this point, we can take hold of our tie rod ends. We're going to start turning the outer tie rod end counterclockwise, unscrewing it from the inner tie rod end. Keep track of the amount of turns it takes to remove it, and go ahead and write that number down. All right, my number was 14. Your results may vary. Now we need to remove our jam nut from the inner tie rod end. To do that, we're going to hold onto the inner tie rod end shaft. You can use some locking pliers if necessary, and your 19mm to remove the mounting nut from that inner tie rod end. Continuing on, we need to follow the inner tie rod end in towards the power steering rack. In this area, we're going to find our power steering rack bellows boot. To start removing this bellows boot, we're going to be using some long nose pliers. At the very end of the bellows boot, we have a squeezable clamp, so I'm going to grab onto the 3 ears. We'll squeeze them towards each other and remove that clamp. If it feels like this clamp is rotted and weak, you can replace it with a wire tie. Let's continue on to the next clamp on the inboard side here. In this area, this is a single-time use clamp. We're essentially going to break it to remove it. Now to remove this, I'm just using a long pry bar and a hammer at the far end. I'm just going to give this a couple taps to break it free. Once you have it broken free, just go ahead and remove it. Continuing on, go ahead and take hold of the bellows boot. We're going to give it a twist and attempt to pull it out and away. If it feels like it's stuck in any place, continue on using an angled pick if necessary. Let's start the removal process for the inner tie rod end next. We're going to follow the inner tie rod end all the way up to the ball and socket joint, where it connects to that power steering rack. Now here's where you're going to have to pay special attention to. As you feel along the socket area of the inner tie rod end, you're going to find that it has a small groove on either side. There's also a washer, and that washer is pinned over into the groove. So we're going to use a pry bar and a hammer, and we'll lightly tap that locking washer out of place, away from the inner tie rod end. There's one side. I'm just going to do the same for the other side here. My application's down along the bottom. Now once you have it so the locking washer is pulled away from the inner tie rod end, we can start removing that inner tie rod end. For this, it's going to be easiest if you have an inner tie rod end removal tool. I have my tool in place. I'm going to start turning this counterclockwise. There we are, it's broken free. At this point, I can remove my tool and we'll continue on unscrewing the rest of this by hand. Now, prior to installation of any brand new part, we need to make sure we clean and inspect our mounting surface here. For this, I'm just using a clean rag. We want to make sure there's no power steering fluid making its way out of the power steering rack. If there is, there's a power steering rack leak, and that will need to be serviced. Other than that, we just want to make sure we don't have any raised areas that's going to cause an issue. Now it's time for installation of the brand new inner tie rod end. Let's make sure we have our locking washer on the end of the inner tie rod end. Now, looking at this washer, we can see our two locking tabs there. If you were looking at the power steering rack, you're going to see exactly where those need to align with. One here, one right there. Let's go ahead and line this up with the power steering rack. We're going to start it in by hand. Once it is started in, we're going to have to carefully reach inside this area. Being aware of any pinch points, take hold of that locking washer. You're going to gently twist it one direction or the other while pressing towards the power steering rack. We need to align those tabs. Okay, as I was pulling it towards the rack, I could feel it slide right into place. I'm going to continue turning this inward, being aware of pinch points. Just double check to make sure that locking washer is seated properly. Let's make sure we tighten this inner tie rod end. Then we have to peen over that locking washer into the grooves on the inner tie rod end. Right there's where it bottomed out. Let's just try to take it a tiny bit further here. We do not want to cause too much pressure and damage our power steering rack, but we do need to make sure this is tight. Go ahead and remove that tool and we'll continue on with the locking washer. Now, for this locking washer, you may find it's easiest using some angled pliers to start peening this in, and you can continue on with a small hammer if necessary. Now that I have the top done, I'm just going to go ahead and do the same exact thing to the bottom here. Now, with your inner tie rod end, you're going to find that it came with a grease packet. This is important to use in the ball and socket joint of the inner tie rod end. We're only going to use approximately 90% of this. Go ahead and press it right in there. I'm going to use a glove finger and I'll work this around as necessary. We can also move the inner tie rod end around so we can gain access to all points of this ball and socket. After lubricating that, we need to make sure we lubricate on the inner tie rod end in the area that the bellows boot is going to sit. They made a clear marking where the end of the bellows boot should be, so let's go ahead and apply a thin amount of lubricant here as well. Spread it around with a gloved finger. This is going to help the alignment professional in the end. As we take this bellows boot and slide it on the inner tie rod end, we need to take the larger diameter side and slide it over the power steering rack. Once we have it in the proper placement on the power steering rack, go ahead and hold it in place. You can use a wire tie for this. Just going to make sure that that's properly seated before continuing on with my wire tie here. Now, as far as our first wire tie, go ahead and start a loop, but we need to leave it loose because we have to slide it over the entire inner tie rod end, down the bellows boot, down towards where that power steering rack was. We'll go ahead and tighten that and make sure it's secure. To help ensure that I have this properly tightened, I'm using some long nose pliers. That's giving me a little bit more leverage here. We'll continue on by removing any excess. Now it's time for the outer portion of that bellows boot. We'll go ahead and start this, but leave it loose. Slide it over the very end of the boot here. And now we'll make sure it's nice and tight. Continuing on, we're going to apply some anti-seize to the threaded portion of the inner tie rod end. I'm going to go approximately halfway up this. This is where I want my jam nut to be. Let's use some anti-seize on the outer portion of the outer tie rod end on the threaded area here. Now it's time for installation of our outer tie rod end. When we go to install this, let's make sure we install it the same amount of turns it took to remove it. There we are. That's my 14 turns that I had for my application. Once we have that done, we can get the outer tie rod end back into our steering knuckle. We can make our adjustments as necessary here. Once you have that in place, go ahead and start on your castle nut. Once it's started on, snug it up and torque it to 36 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, we need to pay attention to the slots on our mounting nut in comparison to the port that makes its way through the stud of the outer tie rod end. It needs to be aligned so we can install our locking cotter pin. If it's not aligned, continue tightening the nut just enough that you can install the locking cotter pin. We'll peen this over so there's no way this mounting nut can loosen up on its own while we're driving down the road. For the jam nut, we're going to turn this counterclockwise, bringing it all the way up against the outer tie rod end. We'll make sure it's nice and tight. You can use a wrench or some long pliers. There we are. We'll just straighten out the outer tie rod end as necessary here. One last quick inspection in this area and we can reinstall our wheel. Once you have the wheel in place, go ahead and start on all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. We'll bottom them out in a crisscross manner, get the wheel back on the ground, and then torque each of them to 76 foot-pounds. Now I have the wheel back down on the ground. Let's go ahead and torque these to that 76 foot-pounds. Okay friend, we finished our installation. Now the next thing you have to do is take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.